Thank you very much, Nikolai, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in Little Rock, Arkansas at the Clinton School of Public Service. I hope you shall not be disappointed with Rena's suggestions after this hour now. When several years after the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, fiscal stresses were high, as were the tensions between the Croats, Bosniaks, and Serbs. The three sides decided to agree on a second round of post-war demobilization. This was a difficult time for all of them, and they asked for World Bank support in helping to design and implement such a program. Now, I had been working on demobilization and reintegration programs in the past, and I was asked to join the World Bank team in this effort, but this was no ordinary context. It was very politically fraught, very sensitive, and a very different level of economy as well, into which demobilized soldiers would be reintegrated. So, not quite sure how best to go about it, we decided we should just invite representatives from all three sides, Croats, Serbs, and Bosniaks, bring them together in a place, and then ask them the questions that we know need to be answered for good design of a project. And so we did. We brought them together for the first time, in fact, for the preparation of the World Bank project in a location outside Sarajevo just for 3 days, and then asked them the questions and saw what they answered. And after 3 days, we basically had together designed the project. And it was their project, it was a project that they felt would be able to address the needs and actually be able also to being implemented. And in fact, at the end, when the project came to a close, it did indeed assist many of the demobilized soldiers find sustainable reintegration options to a greater extent that many other demobilization programs in fact had. This is just one example as to why inclusion in the development process can be a powerful tool. And in fact, I argue that inclusion is a necessary condition for sustainable, equitable, and peaceful development. What I would like to share with you today is starting off with the World Development Report 2011 on conflict, security, and development, which the World Bank issued earlier this year. World Development Reports are the flagship report that the World Bank issues every year. It's on a different topic every year, so last year's was on conflict, security, and development. And to see what messages can come out of that report that would help us decide whether inclusive development in fact has a purpose. There are two main messages that I'd like to convey to you today. One is that inclusion has an intrinsic value and that also there's practical evidence to demonstrate its positive impact. And secondly, there are multiple ways of including people in decisions that affect their own lives. Now, exclusion can be political, can be social, can be economic. And oftentimes it is just discrimination, perhaps. It does not have to lead to violence immediately. However, exclusion indeed may lead to contestation over resources, which in turn may turn violent. And so what are some of the consequences of when exclusion turns violent? You see that around 1.5 billion people live in countries affected by some sort of violence, political violence, criminal violence, or are living in countries that are emerging in the early stages from these predicaments. That's about 20% of the world's population. We know from research for the World Development Report that poverty rates are significantly higher in countries that have been going through repeated cycles of conflict and violence. There's not a single country at the time this report was written back in 2010 that had reached any of the Millennium Development Goals, which shows just enormous development deficit for these countries. But conflict is not just of the political sort of civil wars or interstate wars. It is a lot, in terms of violence, about urban settings. And a lot of the non-political violence, indeed, is predominantly urban. Just to give an example, that in some Latin American countries, the rates of violence are 2 to 3 times as high in urban areas as they are in rural areas. And an extreme example is Nepal, where in 2005-2006, the crime rate and the rate of violence in the capital city, which has about 3% of the country's population, was about a third of the entire crime rates of the country, so about 10 times as much. Violence can have enormous economic costs. You may recall Hurricane Stan, which ravaged Guatemala in the mid-90s. Now, the costs associated with violence were estimated to be twice as high as the damage brought about by Hurricane Stan that year. And the costs of violence are about more than twice as high as the combined budgets of the Ministries of Agriculture, Health, and Education, crucial ministries for any development process. But there are also clear gender dimensions to violence. On the one hand, males are the perpetrators of violence, and males are also mostly the victims of homicides. But when it comes to non-fatal violence, the women are just about as equally likely to be affected by it as men. So men are much more of the perpetrators, and women, in relative terms, more of the victims. Why do conflicts occur in the first place? Now, these are the results of a citizen survey that was carried out in 7 countries in preparation of the World Development Report. And this is based on perceptions. But what's important to see is that perceptions of exclusion or perceptions as to why conflicts occur are as important as real causes of exclusion. And you will see that exclusion from opportunities, for instance, poor education or poverty, inclusion from justice, injustice or inequality, and exclusion from resources, natural resources, were cited as the 3 most common causes as to why conflict occur. The same perception survey also showed that about 40% of citizens felt that unemployment was the most important driver why young people, that's predominantly men, would join gangs or rebel groups. But in fact, there's a lot more to young people being involved in acts of violence. We did a case study on youth in Timor-Leste after the riots in 2006, which caused significant population displacement. And we found that there are different factors that put youth at risk, and again, different factors that push youth into actually engaging in violence. So there are many risk factors, and of course poverty and unemployment being one of them, but it's also lack of connection to family or to community. It's sociocultural factors, it's substance abuse, or it's political marginalization. In Timor, that was an important factor when in the early 2000s youth felt that they were excluded from the nation-building process. These youth may be at risk, but again, not all of these actually engaged in violence. But then you had 2 very critical additional factors that led a number of youth to actually commit violent acts and crimes. One is politicization and manipulation by political leaders for their ends. And secondly, opportunism and impunity, with a very weak justice system and a police that is not able or does not have the capacity to investigate and follow up with a weak prison system and judicial system. Youth just got away with what they did. So these were enabling environments for finally a small part of the youth, of the entire Timorese youth, to get involved in violence. I wanted to show this because engaging in violence is a multidimensional problem and thus needs to be really looked at comprehensively. Now, what the World Development Report has found, and that's perhaps the simplest expression of it is that when internal and external stresses combine with weak or illegitimate institutions, that a country is at higher risk of violence. These stresses can be economic, such as unemployment or severe corruption as well, can be political, contestation between religious, ethnic, or regional groups, or can be security. This may be sort of spillover effects if you think of several countries in Africa, Central and Western Africa, spillover effects from conflict outside your own country, or just legacies of war. What the World Development Report research showed was one of the most crucial factors to stabilizing a situation are institutions. And if they are not legitimate themselves, they actually become part of the problem. Now, what are legitimate institutions? We found that institutions are legitimate if they have the technical capacity and if they are accountable and inclusive. Unfortunately, in many of the fragile contexts, exactly the opposite is the case. Now, these are sort of the relationship of exclusion to violent conflict and crime, but there are other forms of exclusion as well that are incredibly important for humanity as a whole, and that deals with gender inequality. In fact, the World Development Report 2012, which was just issued last month, deals with gender equality and development, and it shows that quite a lot of progress has been made over the past quarter century in a number of areas with regard to gender equality. There's a sharp decline in fertility. There are more women in the labor force, or there are more girls at school, but at the same time, it's clear that a lot of ground has yet to be covered. Gender inequality costs. Just to give you some estimates from the United Nations for East Asia and Pacific countries, the gender inequalities that restrictions on women's access to employment opportunities cost the East Asian Pacific region about $42 to $47 billion a year. Or that inequality of education when girls are not able to attend school at all grade levels as much as boys do, costs the region anywhere between $16 to $30 billion a year. Now, gender inequality, unfortunately, reproduces over generations. For instance, as research for this World Development Report has shown, if mothers work at home, it is more likely that the girls also will end up working at home, and that the boys of this family are more likely to marry women whose mothers were in turn working at home as well. So it reinforces really traditional gender norms. But also there's a relationship between a reproduction of gender inequalities and violence. Again, research has demonstrated that girls who witnessed domestic violence when they were young are more likely to suffer from domestic violence when they are adults. And at the same time, when boys witness domestic violence, they are more likely themselves to commit domestic violence. Let me digress briefly in the area of international development, because exclusion has quite an important effect on aid effectiveness as well. And I'm not talking here about exclusion from the benefits, but I'm talking about exclusion from the decision-making process that leads to the provision of aid. All too often, in particular in emergency situations, people are seen as passive recipients. But what that can end up with is what you see here on the slide. This is an actual case of the provision of an emergency shelter-in-the-box kit that contained a tent, a sleeping bag, cooking stove, and some utensils, a saw, a hammer. The tent was put up very quickly by the aid provider within weeks after the tropical storm, yet it already at the time had not been used. People were preferring to stay in their very shabby and quickly rebuilt huts because they felt they could withstand the tropical storms better than the flimsy tent. But several months later, when the same village was visited, we found the tent neatly packed, back in the box, It had never been used. We found the sleeping bag clean and unused because it was too warm for the tropical climate. We found the cooking stove unused because there was no kerosene to actually operate it. And the only things that were used were the saw and the hammer, which came very handy for rebuilding the shelter. So it is with very good intentions that this aid was provided, and unfortunately it did not help the people much. Coming to what there might be some benefits of inclusion, I will focus on two only, greater social stability, as well as more growth and healthier societies. I should also add, though, just in reference to the previous slide, that inclusion also makes for better development outcomes. In fact, the World Bank's Operations Evaluation Department, at the time, it's now called the Independent Evaluations Group, assessed projects, over 2,500 projects over a 40-year period, against certain dimensions of inclusion, or as we call it, social development. Whether there was participation, whether there was civil society inclusion, involvement in a process, whether they were addressing indigenous peoples and the like. And it found a significant positive impact on development outcomes and institutional performance when projects had such inclusive elements. On greater social stability, in a post-conflict context, there are often many narratives as to how the conflict went, who participated in it, who contributed to the outcome. One example here is from Timor-Leste, when there were serious riots in the year 2002, where many veterans participated who felt that they had not been given due respect and recognition for the services of up to 25 years of independence struggle in the bush and the mountains. But also many who claimed to be veterans, but one couldn't be quite sure whether they were or whether they weren't. So then President Xanana Gusmão led an effort, created commissions that were inclusive, that were acting very transparently and acting in a participatory manner with communities to identify who really the veterans were of the independence struggle. Up to the point where all the lists that had been compiled were then put up on the village administration office so that everyone could see that, yes, these were registered as veterans. If you have any concerns about their inclusion in this list, please come forth, and people did. Or if we missed some out, then please name those two and we register them. And that happened as well. This was a very inclusive process, and as a result, in fact, when the riots broke out in 2006, where youth participated so actively in, veterans were hardly to be seen. A very strong and powerful example of creating a narrative. Another is building inclusive enough coalitions. This is a term that the World Development Report created to create national and local support for change, bringing in the relevant stakeholders to the process. And one very important group for this process can be women. There are numerous peace processes and peace accords that last, as in the case of Papua New Guinea, Bougainville, or for the Liberian peace negotiations back in the early 2000s, or even for tribal disputes over land and natural resources in some areas in the Sudan. The engagement of women's groups helped resolve these problems and thus bring benefits to society at large. But coming back to the notion of gender inequality, so if we included women equitably and equally in the development process, what might this lead to? Well, the argument is it brings more growth and healthier societies. Research has shown that just by giving women the same access to agricultural inputs can improve agricultural productivity by 15–16% in countries like Malawi or Ghana. But just giving women greater rights over tenure, over land, can boost agricultural productivity in Ghana by 6%. So it is nothing else needed but just providing women equal access to these production factors as men have. Investing in women has an impact on the next generation. Again, there's numerous research available that shows that women's education leads to healthier children. They're better nourished, with lower infant mortality, with higher educational levels themselves. And inclusion of women also makes for better governance. There are examples of India and Nepal, for instance, where women were included in committees managing natural resources, and the sustainability of the environment improved as a result. And in fact, very interestingly, there's a study from India that showed that including women in decision-making processes in local committees actually reduces the corruption that exists in these, for these activities. So equal treatment of women as a result matters in its own right, but it's also good for development. Let me give you then just some examples of how inclusive societies can be built. Of course, there are numerous indeed, as I mentioned previously, and let me just name a few that I will not go into detail. But for instance, when projects deal with indigenous peoples or ethnic minorities, to ensure that they have equal rights and access to the benefits of development, while at the same time their heritage, their cultural traditions remain protected. It means giving slum dwellers the same rights to the city. Slum dwellers who live in informal settlements with no land tenure, with very limited, if any, access at all to public transport, public transport not, but to education, to health facilities, and enabling them to become equal residents with urban dwellers, and for them to be able to have equal opportunities in the urban labor market is a very important element, noting that about 1 billion people actually do dwell in slums, in urban centers across the world, an enormous number indeed. There's also access to justice for the poor. It's usually the poor who lack access to legal counsel, whose rights are trampled on. So the provision of paralegals, the provision of grievance redress mechanisms through which they can express their grievances and the grievances are properly dealt with, are all incredibly important elements for building inclusive societies from the bottom up. But let me focus in more detail just on two: holding the state accountable and empowering communities. Now, citizens or villagers, community members, are not just often the passive recipients of aid, they are often also just the passive recipients of public resources. And a lot can go wrong in this process in terms of money inefficiently and ineffectively spent. Noting, for instance, that corruption is quite endemic in many of the poor countries. So enhancing the voice of citizens to hold the state accountable so that it meets their needs is one of the important elements for building inclusive societies. And in fact, by enhancing the voice of citizens, one also enhances the capacity of the state to provide for these needs. There are commonly sort of held three areas: transparency, accountability, and participation. Oftentimes, it's not even known what is at stake. So having information campaigns, having proper communications, using, for instance, community radio, can be a powerful tool to actually letting people know what they would be entitled to. There are various forms of accountability, be it citizen monitoring through citizen report cards, community scorecards, of which I'll show an example shortly, or building in grievance redress mechanisms, be that for specific development projects, be that for more government policy and action as a whole. And participation through things like participatory budgeting, participatory monitoring and evaluation, or co-management committees, for instance, being together on school boards and having citizens basically oversee how schools are run. One interesting example here would be in the Philippines, where they have procurement rules such that there is civil society participation in the procurement process to make sure that the books are not being cooked. Now, the evidence as a whole is is somewhat limited. There has not been that much research into how effective accountability measures actually are, but the evidence that there is shows indeed that they enhance the capacity of the state, that the state provides services and goods that are more relevant to the people, and that there is lower corruption. I just want to give you one example here from Madagascar, from the use of a community scorecard that involves the community as well as the staff of health facilities in how the health facilities are performing in exercising their duty. And a scorecard was applied in February and in June of 2007, so just 4 months apart, and the degree of satisfaction by the community members increased dramatically in just about every category, which means that the service providers really heard the voice of the people, that they weren't providing the services that were really appreciated. There were more drugs available, there were more staff on hand, reception was more professional, the infrastructure, the facilities were kept cleaner and the like. So it's a powerful example as to how giving people voice can really enhance the performance of public service. Now, empowering community is a very powerful tool in any context, be this post-conflict or regular development. And the starting point is that people know best what they need. So participation or asking for the views, that as such is not novel. What the important additional dimension for what we call community-driven development is that one also has the courage and takes the risk of giving the communities the resources to spend for themselves, rather than being spent at some remote level in some project office in a capital city. In essence, it means providing block grants, budget support if you wish, to communities, and it is then up to them within a set of rules with regard to financial management and procurement of how they would spend it. Now, community-driven development works. There have been quite a number of in-depth impact evaluations. Here I show you the most recent one we have from the Philippines, and just go through some of the results with you. The per capita consumption, meaning increased, meaning poverty levels were reduced after, now this, I should add, for project context, was a project that is still operating today, but the evaluation covered the period 2003 to 2010, where about $125 million were spent on over 5,000 community sub-projects, with the communities deciding what they would want to do with that money, mostly local public infrastructure, but also giving them the money to actually carry out the tasks. There was a noticeable increase in labor force participation that was even more noticeable, about twice the amount for women. Because communities wanted to be connected to markets, roads were built which allowed farmers to sell more of their produce at the markets, which in turn increased their incomes. There were obviously more health facilities because communities, remote communities needed those. And villagers would also visit these health facilities, and the services that were offered there were satisfactory to the villagers. And importantly, very much as well, is that the level of trust increased. And interestingly, in the case of the Philippines, that this is the trust not just among the community members, but also to outsiders. So these are powerful examples as to how empowering communities can really aid the development process and reduce poverty. Let me just reflect briefly on perhaps the nicest picture that I have in this regard. It's 2 school buildings in some village in Rwanda. The left was built with a participatory process whereby communities were asked what their priorities would be, and they said, yes, we would like a school building for our children. So the school was built, but it was built by a remotely located project management office. A few years later, there's another project coming to the same community asking what the communities would like. The community said they decided themselves, we want another school building. The other one is just too small, we have too many children. So another school building was erected. However, this time the communities were also given the money to build it. And that's the building on the right. And it goes to show that if you empower communities, if you not just give them decision-making authority, but also expenditure authority, that they spend the money well. And what might surprise you even more is that the building on the right, the one with better quality, also cost less to build. Because it was the community's own money and they wanted to be sure they got the best bargain for their money. Let me close by a parable which we came across in the easternmost province of Indonesia and Papua that talks about the monkey and the fish. It was recounted to us by a tribal leader in reflecting on the relationship between outsiders, be that the government, be that development partners, and the local communities. And as you can see from the parable, what the tribal elder tried to convey was that with the best of intentions, the monkey wanting to save the struggling fish from the water, you still have very bad very bad outcomes, both for the fish and for development, meaning that without adequate knowledge of local context, of local customs, development aid cannot be as effective as it could be. So let me close by reiterating that inclusion has value in itself, but it also helps improve the lives of the poor and of societies at large, and therefore needs to be truly an essential component of everything that we do in development cooperation. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Kate.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Kate Covey, and I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School. And I really liked the concept of building a national narrative that you talked about in East Timor. And I thought that the concept of building a national narrative could be very positive for social cohesion. And I was hoping you would talk a little bit more about that and about how to disseminate and create buy-in for that national narrative, because that was obviously a problem. You talked about how the youth were involved in a lot of uprisings, so they hadn't bought into that national narrative. So I'm interested about creating inclusive buy-in for this educated narrative about post-conflict resolution. Thank you.
One by one. Yeah. Just picking up on the case of Timor-Leste, the concern of youth was not so much the national narrative that was created around the resistance struggle, but it was the fact, among others, but from a national narrative perspective, that they felt excluded from the process of nation building. And let me be specific here. Already back in 1999, immediately after the Indonesians left the country, youth had both returned from universities where they had been studying in Indonesia, as well as those who had been living in Timor and assisting the independence struggle one way or another, have come together to see how they, as the next generation, can help shape whatever comes next for this to-be state. When the Timorese leadership returned, they brought with them the language with which they had left. And they decided to declare Portuguese as a national language, which meant that just about none of the youth who weren't able to, none of the youth were able to speak Portuguese and were automatically excluded from a process of nation building which the government had launched. That led to a lot of frustration already back in 1999, mind you. Later, the language issue was was put forth in law. And those who had studied in Indonesia or who had grown up in the Indonesian school system in Timor just felt that they were not heard. And even not in the local languages, that there was a barrier so that youth could not help determine the future of the state. This was not the single most important factor, but it was a very important factor as to why youth became so heavy players in the 2006 violence. Now, in a sense, it's part of the narrative that they got right and others got wrong. When I referred to the issue of the veterans, it is on another level, or it's another slice, if it were, of an overall national narrative. There are many countries, and even the World Bank has worked in a few cases in Africa, where after many years of peace, suddenly there are more veterans than estimated to be at the time of the end of war. Yet these veterans becoming very vocal, being themselves used or abused by political leaders to their personal ends. One case in point most certainly is Zimbabwe, where according to some estimates, 15 years after independence, there were twice as many veterans than at the time actually independence happened. Yet they were the most vocal ones in demonstrations to get benefits for veterans. Yeah. And the process that was the extraordinary part of the process that the Timorese authorities did at the time was not just to say, oh, we have a registration process and everyone who claims to be a veteran and they sort of ask some questions about the conflict where they supposedly served will be registered. That would have been the easy solution. But the authorities went a critical step further and actually involved the entire country, I mean all the villages across the country, in determining were these or were these not veterans. But in the process, they also reflected about the independence struggle, which had two very distinct phases, 75 to 79, which was more of a full-scale rebellion, if you wish, or civil war with organized units, and from the early 80s up until Indonesian withdrawal in 1999, where this was very much isolated units operating with lots of community support. And getting the history of conflict in Timor-Leste right was also, perhaps for President Gusmão, a purposeful byproduct, for others, for observers, perhaps more of a fortunate additional outcome, but it most certainly was. And that there is no contestation anymore as to, I mean, not on a significant scale, as to what happened during the years of independence, during the years of occupation, where there were many Timorese factions fighting each other. This was not just one united Timorese front. So bringing this together very openly was really crucial to building a common purpose, as it were, for this young state.
John.
Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Kellen Utek, and I'm a first-year student at the Clinton School. Recently, Tunisia held their elections, the first country, I believe, that participated in the Arab Spring to hold elections, and a mandate was that 50% of the ballot had to be occupied by women, I believe was the mandate. And I was wondering if you see this as becoming a norm for other countries that participated in the Arab Spring. And also, is there an example of a predominantly Muslim country where a mandate such like this has led to a legacy of social inclusion for women?
As to the latter part of the question, I would not know. I couldn't tell you. As to the former, Tunisia is not the only country that has sort of a mandatory representation of women in elected bodies. It might well be the first case for the Arab world. It's certainly at 50% is something that I very much like to see, because in other countries there's often, for some reason, women exclusion sort of aims for 30% or perhaps 25%. I'm not ever quite sure why. I think this is a brave move, one that certainly reflects the makeup of society, and I very much hope that this experiment, as it were, for North Africa and the Middle East will draw positive results.
Thank you again for being here. I'm a second-year student as well. My question is about the community-driven development and community empowerment that you were speaking about. I wonder if you could give a specific example of specifically how the money is allocated and who oversees that within the community. Because one of the things I think would be most worrisome is the power disparities that could be brought into the community with money coming in. Thank you.
I give you sort of every project will have its own specific details. So I'm trying to reflect more on general characteristics, but also then refer to the case of Philippines and other countries. The allocation of the funds. First of all, it's important to appreciate that any decision to decentralize such decision-making requires a centralized decision. Central government needs to be willing to provide funds to the local level for communities to spend. Now, as to how much money goes to each community, there are different formulas. This can be, as in the case of the Philippines, the same amount for each barangay, which is the low-level administrative layer, regardless of population density, or it can be more in the system of the Indonesia program, where it's related to population, to the population in the particular district or village, and therefore villages that are bigger, with more people, have greater allocation. So that's allocation of money to the communities. The communities themselves then would decide as to where they want to allocate the money to. There's usually a short, what we call negative list, things that cannot be done with the money, like buying weapons or doing something that's detrimental to the environment. But otherwise, they're quite free to decide whether they want a road, whether they want the road to build here, or whether they want to support income-generating activities for particular groups, for women, for instance. These decisions are usually made by what we call community development committees, who are elected bodies. So you can have elected community development committees even in countries where there is no sort of tradition of democracy. And these are actually quite interesting test cases then for village-level democracy, even in the case of China, for instance, where we have a project that is based on these principles. And these committees also aim to have adequate representation of women. Some do have gender requirements, others do not. And then whether the communities themselves elect the treasurer or sort of someone who holds the money and does all the procurement work, or whether there is some capacity reinforcement, as it were, from the project office to have a dedicated person in that community to then handle the money. Again, that depends very much by context. The importance is that decisions and the use of money be transparent. So there's always outreach to the community and continue. So, for instance, putting income and expenditure sheets, as it were, up on the notice boards of the village to make sure that everyone knows where the money is coming from and where it's going to, and that it indeed is the right amounts as agreed. So it's a very transparent process as well.
Well, Dr. Kostner, thank you so much for coming, and Rena did not disappoint, and thank you all for coming out, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.